The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden fingers across the rippling surface of the water, a sight that never failed to ground me. This wasn't just any body of water. This was Miller's Pond, and it was the crown jewel of a 12-acre sanctuary that my family had defended for over 6 decades. My grandfather, a man of grit and calloused hands, had purchased this land back when this entire county was nothing but dense woods and sprawling farmland. He didn't just buy the land, he shaped it. He rented heavy equipment, and with a few neighbors who valued community over contracts, he dug this pond out of the Georgia red clay with his own 2 hands. Growing up here, the pond was the heartbeat of our lives. I remember my father's steady hand on my shoulder as he taught me to cast my first line, the thrill of the 4th of July cookouts where the air smelled of charcoal and pine, and the countless birthday parties where the only rule was to stay away from the deep end. It was a modest life in a modest house, but to us it was an empire. When my father passed, he left it all to me with a single, unspoken command: keep it in the family. And I intended to do exactly that. But the world outside our tree line didn't stay quiet. About 20 years ago, the silence was shattered by the sound of chainsaws and bulldozers. A massive developer had bought every surrounding acre of farmland, eyeing our 12-acre island like a missing puzzle piece. They called the new development Tyrant Estates, a name that in hindsight was far too accurate. They approached my father multiple times, waving checks with more zeros than he'd ever seen, but he refused every single time. He wasn't a man who could be bought. Eventually, the developers grew tired of his no and simply built around us, encircling our property with rows of cookie-cutter McMansions and a homeowners association, HOA, designed to enforce a very specific kind of suburban perfection. For years, there was a tentative peace. The original homeowners understood the geography. They knew the man in the big house with the pond wasn't a member of their club. We never signed a single HOA document, never agreed to their restrictive covenants, and never paid a dime in dues because we simply weren't part of their jurisdiction. We were a private entity, a ghost in their machine. My parents even invited some of those early neighbors over to fish, fostering a sense of mutual respect. But time is a cruel editor. The old guard moved away or passed on, replaced by a new wave of residents who saw the world through the lens of entitlement. They didn't see a family legacy. They saw a community amenity that was being hoarded by a recluse. They saw the shimmering water and the lush green banks and assumed their high HOA fees bought them a ticket to it. The first crack in the peace appeared about 3 years ago. I walked out onto my back porch to find a family I'd never seen before spreading a picnic blanket on my grass just feet from the water's edge. I approached them politely, assuming they were just lost. "Excuse me," I said, "but you're actually on private property." The father didn't look apologetic, he looked offended. "What are you talking about?" he scoffed, pointing toward the rows of houses behind him. "This is the HOA pond area. It's right here on the community map we got when we moved in." I stood there stunned. I explained the property lines, practically walking him to the edge of the woods to show him where his world ended and mine began. He grumbled, packed up his sandwiches, and left, but the look he gave me wasn't one of understanding, it was one of suspicion. I told myself it was a one-time mistake, a misunderstanding by a confused newcomer. I should have checked the county records that very day. I should have realized that a storm was brewing, led by people who didn't care about deeds or history, but only about what they felt they were owed. By ignoring that first red flag, I had unknowingly invited the HOA to try and steal the very ground I stood on. The shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated. Every ship needs a captain, and Tyrant Estates had recently elected a new HOA president who treated the suburban streets like her own personal fiefdom. Her name was Mrs. Gable, but behind her back, the younger residents called her the Enforcer. Mrs. Gable was a woman who seemed to vibrate with a restless, nervous energy, usually channeled into measuring the height of people's grass with a literal ruler, or sending out stinging emails about the unacceptable shade of beige someone had painted their mailbox. She lived in the largest McMansion in the cul-de-sac, directly overlooking the eastern edge of my property. From her second-story balcony, she had a bird's-eye view of my pond, and I could often see her standing there, binoculars in hand, like a hawk watching a field mouse. To Mrs. Gable, my 12 acres were an eyesore, not because they were unkempt, but because they were uncontrolled. My wilder patches of tall grass, the ancient, gnarled oak trees, and the natural, unmanicured edge of the pond were an affront to her vision of a sterilized, concrete paradise. I first met her officially on a Tuesday afternoon. I was out near the water, fixing a loose plank on my small wooden dock, when I heard the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of expensive heels hitting the asphalt of the nearby community road, followed by the crunch of gravel as she stepped, without hesitation, onto my grass. "Excuse me, Mr. Miller, is it?" she called out. Her voice had that forced, honey-sweet quality that usually precedes a very bitter demand. I stood up, wiping grease from my hands onto a rag. "That's me. Can I help you with something?" She stopped about 5 feet away, her eyes scanning the pond with a look of profound disapproval. "I'm Mrs. Gable, president of the Highland Estates HOA. I've been reviewing our community aesthetics and the recent complaints regarding, well, this area." She waved a hand vaguely toward my pond. "Complaints?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I don't belong to your HOA, Mrs. Gable. Whatever complaints your residents have aren't really my concern." Her smile didn't falter, but it grew colder. "See, that's where you're mistaken, Liam. While your parcel may be technically independent, your actions, or lack thereof, affect the property values of everyone in Highland Estates. This pond, for instance, it's a mosquito breeding ground. It lacks the proper filtration systems required by our bylaws. And frankly, the lack of a perimeter fence is a liability for our children." "It's a natural ecosystem," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the rising heat in my chest. "It's been here since before these houses were even a blueprint. It's my private property, and I like it exactly how it is." Mrs. Gable took a step closer, her perfume cloying in the humid air. "We are a community of standards, Mr. Miller. I'm here to offer you a graceful way out. The board has authorized me to offer you a fair market value for these 12 acres. We intend to incorporate this pond into our official recreation plan. We'll dredge it, line it with stone, and put in a nice fountain. You'll be compensated and you can move somewhere, more suited to your lifestyle." I almost laughed. "My lifestyle? You mean living on the land my grandfather built? Thanks for the offer, but this place isn't for sale. Not today, not ever." The mask finally slipped. Her lips thinned into a hard, straight line. "You're being short-sighted. This land is an island of chaos in a sea of order. We cannot have a dead zone in the middle of our community where the rules don't apply. If you won't work with us, we will be forced to ensure that this property meets the standards of the neighborhood, one way or another." "Is that a threat?" I asked. "It's a promise of rectification," she snapped. She turned on her heel and marched back toward the paved road, her posture rigid with indignation. As I watched her go, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the breeze. It wasn't just about the pond anymore. Mrs. Gable didn't just want the land. She wanted to break the person who dared to say no to her. That evening, I noticed a new post on the community's private Facebook group, shared with me by an old friend who still lived in the estates. It was a photo of my pond, taken from a high angle, likely Mrs. Gable's balcony, with a caption that read, "Our common area is currently being occupied by a squatter who refuses to allow residents access. We are working with legal counsel to reclaim what is ours. Stay tuned for the grand opening of the Highland Estates Nature Preserve." The audacity was breathtaking. She wasn't just planning to take the land. She was already telling the neighborhood that it already belonged to them. The trap was being set, and I was the only one who didn't know the rules of the game she was playing. The following week, the atmosphere in Tyrant Estates shifted from cold to openly hostile. It started with the adventurers. I was in my kitchen brewing a pot of coffee when I looked out the window and saw a group of teenagers launched a kayak, my kayak that I kept tied to the dock, into the center of the pond. They were shouting, splashing, and acting as if they were at a public park. I walked out, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Hey, out of the water now!" I shouted from the bank. One of the kids, a boy about 16 wearing a Tyrant Estates high school jersey, looked at me with pure confusion. "Chill out, man," he yelled back. "Mrs. Gable said the pond is open for the summer season. It's in the newsletter." I had to threat to call the police just to get them to paddle back to shore. They left, but not before calling me a bitter old hermit. That was the moment I realized Mrs. Gable wasn't just talking, she was mobilizing. She was using the neighborhood's children and families as pawns to establish adverse possession. A legal term my father had once warned me about, where if someone uses your land long enough without you stopping them, they can eventually claim it's theirs. Later that afternoon, I decided to do some reconnaissance of my own. I waited until dusk and walked over to the community's main entrance, where a large, glass-encased wooden board displayed the official map of Tyrant Estates. I stood there in the flickering light of the street lamps, and my jaw dropped. The map had been professionally altered. In the original blueprints from 20 years ago, my 12 acres were clearly marked as a grayed-out area labeled NA, not applicable, or private out parcel. But this new map, glossy, colorful, and stamped with the HOA seal, showed my entire property, including the pond and the wooded trail leading to it, shaded in the same bright green as the community park. It was labeled the Highland Estates Nature Preserve and Fishing Club. Incredible, I whispered to myself. She hadn't just lied. She had committed a massive act of cartographic fraud. She was selling a lie to every new homeowner who moved in, likely using the pond as a selling point to drive up property values and HOA dues. The next morning, I drove down to the county registrar's office. I needed to see the master deed. If there was even a shred of truth to their claim, I needed to know. The clerk, an older woman named Martha who had worked there since the Reagan administration, pulled the dusty microfilm for my plot. "Here it is, honey," she said, pointing to the screen. "Plot 402B owned by the Miller family since 1954. Boundary lines are crystal clear. And here," she slid another reel into the machine, "is the filing for Tyrant Estates from 2004. See that bold black line? That's the developer's boundary. They stopped exactly 24 feet short of your pond's eastern bank." "So the HOA has no claim?" I asked. "None," Martha said firmly. "Unless you signed a joinder agreement or a quitclaim deed, they're basically trying to steal a mountain with a molehill's worth of authority." I felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Martha leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But listen, Liam, I've seen this HOA President, Gable. She's been in here 3 times in the last month asking about easements and abandoned land statutes. She's looking for a loophole, or she's trying to create one. You need to get yourself a surveyor and a lawyer, and you need to do it yesterday." As I left the building, I saw Mrs. Gable's silver SUV parked across the street. She was sitting inside, her hands gripped tight on the steering wheel, watching me. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stared with a cold, predatory intensity. I realized then that having the truth on my side wasn't going to be enough. In the world of HOAs, perception is often treated as reality. If she told 200 families that the pond was theirs, and they started treating it like it was theirs, my truth would be buried under the weight of a neighborhood mob. I called Sarah Jenkins, a local attorney known for being a pit bull in property disputes. "Sarah," I said as soon as she picked up, "the HOA just put my backyard on their official map. They're telling people they own my family's legacy." "Don't say another word on an unencrypted line," Sarah replied, her voice sharp and professional. "Document every trespasser, take photos of that map, and whatever you do, Liam, do not get into a physical fight with them. That's exactly what a woman like Gable wants. She wants to paint you as the unhinged neighbor so she can justify protecting the community from you." I hung up and looked at the pond. The water was still, reflecting the trees like a perfect mirror. It was peaceful for now, but I knew the reflection was about to be shattered. The neighborhood clubhouse was a sprawling, colonial-style building that smelled of floor wax and expensive air freshener. Usually, it was a place for bridge clubs and birthday parties, but tonight it felt like a courtroom. I had spent the last 48 hours gathering every scrap of paper I owned. The 1954 original land deed, the property tax receipts from the last 20 years, and the certified letter Sarah Jenkins had drafted. As I walked through the double doors, the chatter stopped. Heads turned. I saw neighbors I'd known for a decade, people I'd shared lawn care tips with, now looking at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. At the front of the room, seated behind a long mahogany table, was the HOA board, and in the center, looking like a queen presiding over her court, was Mrs. Gable. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice amplified by a microphone. "How nice of you to join us. Although this is a meeting for members of the Highland Estates HOA, since you claim you aren't a member, your presence here is unorthodox. I'm here because you're showing a map that claims my backyard is a nature preserve, Mrs. Gable," I said, walking down the center aisle. I held up a copy of the fraudulent map I'd photographed. "This is a lie. I've been to the county registrar. I have the master deed. You are intentionally misleading your residents." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A man in the third row, Bill, stood up. "Now hold on, Liam. Mrs. Gable showed us the developmental plans. She said the pond was part of the Green Initiative for the whole neighborhood. We pay $400 a month in dues partly to maintain these common areas. Are you saying we're paying for something that isn't ours?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, Bill," I replied. "You're being scammed by your own board." Mrs. Gable slammed a gavel down on the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "That is enough. Mr. Miller, you are an outsider trying to sow discord in a harmonious community. The map you refer to is part of our proposed expansion, an expansion based on the principle of community easement. Our legal team is currently reviewing the fact that for 20 years this neighborhood has provided the infrastructure, the roads, the drainage, the security that you benefit from for free. The pond is a natural extension of that infrastructure. It's a hole in the ground my grandfather dug," I shot back. "It has nothing to do with your drainage or your security." "The board has a responsibility to the homeowners," Mrs. Gable continued, ignoring me and addressing the crowd. "We cannot have an unregulated, high-risk body of water in the center of our children's play area. It is a safety hazard and a liability. We have filed a petition with the city to have the pond declared a public necessity. If Mr. Miller refuses to maintain it to our standards, the HOA will be forced to take over the stewardship of the land to protect your property values." The crowd erupted. Half of them were cheering for safety, while the other half looked confused. Mrs. Gable had masterfully pivoted the argument from ownership to safety and property values, the two things suburban homeowners care about most. I stepped closer to the table, leaning in so only the board could hear me. "I have a lawyer, Mrs. Gable. Her name is Sarah Jenkins. You might have heard of her. She's already filing a slander of title suit against you personally, not just the HOA." For a split second, I saw a flash of genuine fear in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a sneer. "Sarah Jenkins is a bottom feeder. Our firm, Blackwood and Associates, handles multi-million-dollar developments. We will bury you in discovery motions and legal fees until you're forced to sell that pond just to pay your bills." She looked at the security guard standing by the door. "Mr. Miller is disrupting a private meeting. Please escort him out." As the guard put a hand on my shoulder, I looked back at my neighbors. "Check your contracts," I yelled. "She's spending your dues on a legal war she can't win. She's gambling with your money." I was pushed out into the cool night air. The doors closed behind me, muffling the sound of the mob. I stood in the parking lot, my hands shaking. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for a pond anymore. I was fighting for my home against a machine that had unlimited funds and zero ethics. I looked at the dark silhouette of my house in the distance, the pond reflecting the moonlight, and I made a vow. They wanted a war. They were going to get one. But they forgot one thing. I knew every inch of that land. They were just looking at a map. I was standing on the truth. Saturday morning arrived with a deceptive stillness. The mist clung to the surface of the pond like a white silk sheet, and the only sound was the occasional rhythmic plop of a largemouth bass breaking the surface. I was sitting on my weathered wooden dock, a thermos of coffee by my side and my favorite spinning rod in my hand. After the chaos of the HOA meeting, I needed this. I needed to remind myself why I was fighting. This wasn't just water and dirt, it was peace. But that peace was shattered at exactly 9:15 a.m. I heard the sound of multiple car doors slamming in the cul-de-sac that bordered my property. I didn't even have to turn around to know who it was. The heavy, rhythmic stomping of feet on my grass told the story. I looked back to see a small army of about 12 people. At the front was Mrs. Gable, looking like she was ready for a safari in high-end athletic wear and a visor. Behind her was Bill, along with two other families I recognized from the neighborhood, carrying folding chairs, coolers, and fishing tackle. "Good morning, Liam," Mrs. Gable called out, her voice dripping with artificial cheer. "We've decided to host the first official Highland Estates family fishing derby today. Since you were so vocal about the pond's natural beauty, we figured you love to see it being put to good use by the community." I stood up, my grip tightening on my fishing rod. "Mrs. Gable, I've told you a dozen times, this is private property. You are trespassing, all of you. Bill, you know better. Turn around and go back to the sidewalk." Bill looked uncomfortable, shifting his cooler from one hand to the other. "Look, Liam, the HOA email said the city issued a temporary public access permit because of the map discrepancy. We just want to let the kids fish." "There is no permit, Bill. She's lying to you," I shouted. Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her face turning a deep shade of crimson. "I have had enough of your obstructionism, Liam Miller. This water is a resource, and you are hoarding it. If you won't step aside for the families of this community, then we will have to involve someone who can make you." She pulled her iPhone from her pocket with a flourish and dialed 3 digits. She put it on speaker, her voice suddenly transforming into a panicked, high-pitched wail. "Yes, 911. I need an officer at 402 Tyrant Lane immediately. There is a man, Liam Miller. He's acting extremely aggressive. He's brandishing a weapon, a long metal rod. He's threatening children at the community pond. Please, we're terrified for our safety." I stood there stunned. "A weapon? It's a fishing rod, you lunatic." The crowd behind her started murmuring. Some of the parents looked worried, while others, fueled by Mrs. Gable's theatrics, started shouting at me to put the weapon down. It was surreal. I was being painted as a violent criminal on the very dock where I used to eat popsicles with my grandfather. 6 minutes later, the high-pitched wail of a siren cut through the suburban quiet. A cruiser from the county sheriff's office roared up the curb, followed by a second unit. 2 officers jumped out. One was a young rookie, hand hovering nervously over his holster, and the other was Deputy Miller, no relation, a veteran officer with a face like weathered granite. "Everybody stay back," the rookie yelled, pointing at me. "Sir, drop the rod, drop it now." I slowly laid my fishing rod on the dock and raised my hands. Mrs. Gable ran toward the officers, clutching her chest. "Oh, thank God you're here. He's been screaming at us, telling us he's going to take us out if we touch his water. He's clearly unstable." Deputy Miller looked at me, then at the group of families with their coolers and lawn chairs, and then at the shimmering pond. He didn't look impressed. He walked over to me, his boots thumping on the dock. "Mr. Miller, I've been out here before for noise complaints, but never for a man with a weapon. You want to tell me what's going on?" "Deputy," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage, "I am standing on my own dock, on land that has been in my family for 60 years. These people are trespassing. I asked them to leave, and that woman decided to fabricate a felony because she wants my pond for her HOA." "He's lying," Mrs. Gable shrieked. "Check the maps. The HOA maps clearly show." "I don't care about HOA maps, ma'am," Deputy Miller interrupted, his voice cold. "HOAs don't have the authority to override county property lines." He turned back to me. "Liam, do you have your deed and a recent survey in that house?" "I do, right on the kitchen table," I replied. "Wait here," the deputy told the crowd. "Nobody moves. If anyone touches that water while I'm inside, they're going to the station for trespassing." I led the deputy toward my house, leaving Mrs. Gable standing on the grass, her mouth hanging open in silent fury. "The 911 trap," she had set was about to snap shut, but not on the person she expected. Inside the quiet of my living room, the air felt thick with the history of the Miller family. Deputy Miller stood by the mahogany dining table as I spread out the documents like a general preparing for a counteroffensive. I showed him the original 1954 deed, yellowed with age but with the ink still sharp, and the recent survey I had commissioned after the first HOA meeting. The deputy pulled out a pair of reading glasses and leaned over the survey map. He traced the bold black lines that marked the perimeter of my 12 acres. "So, this dotted line here," he pointed, "that's the HOA's actual boundary." "Exactly," I said. "Their legal jurisdiction ends 24 feet before the water even starts. Mrs. Gable has been showing a map to the residents that literally moves that line into the middle of my pond." Deputy Miller sighed, a long, weary sound. "I see this all the time with these new developments. They get a little power and think they can rewrite the county records." He walked back out onto the porch, his presence commanding immediate silence from the mob. Mrs. Gable was practically vibrating with anticipation. "Well, Deputy, is he coming with you in handcuffs?" "No, ma'am," Deputy Miller said, his voice booming. "But you and your friends are about to leave. I've reviewed the legal deed and a certified land survey. This man is standing on his own private property. This pond is not a community asset, and your 911 call was based on a false report." The crowd gasped. Bill looked like he wanted to melt into the grass. Mrs. Gable's face went from red to a sickly, pale white. "That's impossible, our board lawyers." "Your board lawyers are going to have a very busy Monday," the deputy interrupted. "Everyone, pack up your chairs and your coolers. If I see anyone from Highland Estates on this side of the tree line again today, I'm skipping the warning and going straight to a trespassing citation." The retreat was pathetic. People scrambled to grab their gear, avoiding my eyes. Bill mumbled an "I'm sorry, Liam," as he lugged his cooler away. Mrs. Gable, however, didn't apologize. She stood her ground for a final second, glaring at me with a hatred so pure it was chilling. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You can't fight the entire neighborhood forever." As the last of them crossed back onto the HOA paved road, I felt a temporary sense of victory, but I knew the real war was just beginning. Monday morning, I was in Sarah Jenkins' office before she had even finished her first cup of coffee. Sarah looked at the photos I had taken of the Derby and the deputy's bodycam footage, which we had requested. She smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a shark that had just caught the scent of blood. "Liam, she just handed us the keys to the kingdom, calling 911 under false pretenses while attempting to seize private land. That's not just a neighborly dispute anymore. That's slander of title and intentional infliction of emotional distress." "What's the plan?" I asked. "We don't just sue the HOA," Sarah said, leaning back in her leather chair. "We sue them for a permanent injunction to prevent them from ever mentioning your property in their literature again. And then we go after the board members personally for breach of fiduciary duty. They are using the homeowners' dues to fund an illegal land grab. When the residents realize their monthly fees are going toward a losing legal battle, they'll turn on Gable faster than you can cast a line." Over the next 2 weeks, the legal warfare escalated. Sarah sent a cease and desist that was 20 pages long, attached to a $500,000 lawsuit. We also hired an independent third-party surveying firm, the most prestigious one in the state, to drive permanent steel stakes into the ground every 10 feet along the boundary. We painted the tops of the stakes international orange. I also installed a high-definition 4K camera system around the pond with signs that read, "Private property, you are being recorded. Trespassers will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." The HOA's response was a desperate countersuit. They claimed that because my family had allowed people to walk near the pond for 20 years, we had granted a prescriptive easement. They were trying to argue that by being a nice neighbor in the past, I had legally given up my rights to the land. It was a dirty, bottom-tier legal tactic, and it set the stage for a final showdown in front of a judge. The stakes were no longer just about fishing. It was about whether a family's history could be erased by the sheer greed of a suburban committee. The county courthouse was a cold, imposing building of gray stone and echoing hallways. This was where the pond war would finally be decided. I sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing the only suit I owned, which felt uncomfortably tight around the shoulders. To my left sat Sarah Jenkins, her laptop open and a mountain of organized folders stacked neatly before her. Across the aisle sat Mrs. Gable, flanked by 3 high-priced attorneys from Blackwood and Associates. She looked different today, not the confident enforcer I saw on her balcony, but a woman whose grip on power was beginning to slip. Behind her sat a dozen or so HOA members. Some were there to support her, but many others were there because Sarah had leaked the HOA's legal expenses to the community. They were starting to realize that their Common Area Improvement Fund was being drained to pay for this specific courtroom drama. The Honorable Judge Whittaker, a man known for his no-nonsense approach to property disputes, peered over his spectacles as he called the court to order. The HOA's lead counsel, a man with a voice like polished sandpaper, began his opening statement. Your Honor, this is a case of community welfare. For 2 decades, the Highland Estates development has surrounded the property in question. We contend that through prescriptive easement and implied dedication, this pond has become a functional part of the community's infrastructure. Mr. Miller has allowed the public to use this space for years, only to suddenly withdraw access in a fit of neighborly spite. Sarah didn't even wait for him to sit down before she stood up. Your Honor, the defense is attempting to gaslight this court. Neighborly spite is not a legal doctrine. A legacy deed from 1954, however, is. The next few hours were a whirlwind of technical testimony. We called the county surveyor to the stand. He presented the GPS-mapped boundaries, proving that the HOA's official map was a complete fabrication. Then, Sarah delivered the knockout blow. She called the HOA's former secretary, a woman named Linda who had resigned in protest months ago. Linda, Sarah asked, did Mrs. Gable ever discuss the accuracy of the community maps in your presence? Linda nodded nervously. In a board meeting last year, the treasurer pointed out that the pond wasn't ours. Mrs. Gable told us to fix the map anyway. She said that if we treated it like ours long enough, no one would remember it wasn't. She called it manifest destiny for the suburbs. A collective gasp went up from the HOA members in the gallery. Mrs. Gable's lead attorney looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. But the climax came when Mrs. Gable herself was called to the stand. Sarah didn't ask her about the land at first. She asked about the 911 call. Mrs. Gable, you told the emergency operator that Mr. Miller was brandishing a weapon. Is that correct? He was being aggressive with a metal object, Mrs. Gable stammered. Sarah played the body cam footage from Deputy Miller. On the large screen in the courtroom, everyone saw me standing calmly on my dock, holding nothing but a graphite fishing rod. Is this the weapon that terrified you, Mrs. Gable? Sarah asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Or was the emergency simply that a private citizen was standing on his own land, refusing to let you steal it? It belongs to the community, Mrs. Gable suddenly screamed, losing her composure. That pond is the only thing that makes this neighborhood elite. Without it, we're just another bunch of houses in the woods. He has no right to keep it for himself. Judge Whittaker slammed his gavel so hard a glass of water on his bench rattled. That is enough, Mrs. Gable. You are in a court of law, not a homeowners' meeting. You do not get to decide whose rights are important based on your personal standards of elitism. The judge leaned back, looking at the HOA board members in the audience. I have seen enough. It is rare to see a case of such blatant bad faith maneuvering. Mr. Miller's title is clear. The HOA's maps are fraudulent, and the conduct of this board is borderline criminal. He announced he would take a short recess before delivering the final judgment, but the look he gave Mrs. Gable told us everything we needed to know. The pond war was over. The only question now was how much it was going to cost the HOA for their arrogance. The silence in the courtroom was heavy as Judge Whittaker returned to the bench. He didn't look at the lawyers. He looked directly at the HOA board members seated in the back. His expression was one of profound disappointment, the kind a father has for a child who has finally pushed things too far. "In 30 years on the bench," the judge began, his voice echoing, "I have rarely seen such a calculated attempt to disenfranchise a private citizen of their ancestral land. Mrs. Gable, your actions were not just an administrative error. They were a deliberate act of fraud." The judgment was devastating. The court issued a permanent injunction, legally barring the Highland Estates HOA from ever claiming, mapping, or stepping foot on Miller's Pond. But the judge didn't stop there. He awarded Liam $350,000 in compensatory and punitive damages for slander of title, emotional distress, and the legal fees accumulated during the war. Perhaps the most stinging blow was the judge's order regarding the community map. The HOA was legally required to send a certified letter to every single resident of Tyrant Estates, at their own expense, admitting that the pond was private property and that the board had provided false information to the homeowners. As we walked out of the courthouse, the atmosphere among the residents had shifted. The supporters who had followed Mrs. Gable into battle were now looking at her with cold fury. They realized that their HOA dues, thousands of dollars per household, were about to skyrocket to cover the $350,000 judgment and the astronomical fees for the lawyers she had hired. Mrs. Gable tried to maintain her composure, walking toward her silver SUV, but she was stopped by Bill. "You lied to us, Karen," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "You told us we had a right to that water. Now my kids are asking why the police had to come, and I'm looking at a special assessment fee that I can't afford. You're done." The fallout was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, a petition was circulated through the neighborhood. Over 90% of the residents signed a vote of no confidence. The entire board was forced to resign, but for Mrs. Gable, the humiliation was personal. Because the judge had ruled she acted with malice, the HOA's insurance refused to cover her portion of the liability. She had to sell her McMansion just to pay her share of the damages. I watched from my dock a month later as the "for sale" sign went up in her yard. She was packing boxes into a moving truck, her eyes occasionally darting toward my property. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I simply sat there with my fishing rod, a cold drink in my hand, and enjoyed the silence that had finally returned to Miller's Pond. The new HOA board was elected shortly after. They were a group of younger, more sensible homeowners who actually cared about community rather than control. Their first act was to send me a formal letter of apology and a basket of high-end lures. We reached a good neighbor agreement. I would allow them to keep their jogging trail near the edge of my woods, and in return, they would maintain a buffer zone of privacy and never mention the word easement again. The pond is quiet now. The nature preserve signs are gone, replaced by the simple, honest boundary of the Miller family. Sometimes on a quiet evening, I see the neighborhood kids walking their dogs on the paved road. They look over at the water and I'll give them a small wave. They know the rules now, and more importantly, they know that in this little corner of the world, history and truth are still worth fighting for. My grandfather would have been proud. He didn't just dig a pond, he dug a foundation that no amount of suburban greed could wash away. And that, friends, is how you handle a Karen who thinks her HOA rules apply to the entire world. Liam protected his legacy, and the HOA learned a very expensive lesson in property law. If you think Mrs. Gable got exactly what she deserved, smash that like button right now. Have you ever had a neighbor try to take over your yard or call the cops for no reason? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one of them. And if you want to see more pro-revenge stories where the bullies finally lose, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching, and remember, always keep your deeds close and your lawyers closer. See you in the next one.